Oh boy, this video was months in the making. I read so many books on various topics that touched on this one from a variety of angles, including primary sources that merely mention divination and its outcomes. And I still barely feel like I scratched the surface. Divination can be one of the most contentious topics I've seen in the Hellenist community. I've even seen suggestions in some places that divination is automatically magic and thereby ahistorical in Hellenism, which makes no sense because Greece had and still has many folk magic traditions, as I covered in my video on the topic, and divination was such a core component of ancient Greek religious practice that literal city-states would consult oracles before making major decisions. There's no reason why modern Hellenists should be deprived of this wonderful way to connect with the gods just because the great oracles are no longer staffed. So, let's take a deep dive into divination. Karate. In my video on the priesthood, link in the iCard, I touched on the topic of Mantike, or roving diviners that are often translated as priests in the English translation of the epics, but performed a different function than the hieroi, or temple priests, in Hellenic society. I will briefly mention them a bit later, but first we're going to need to talk a bit about how divination was seen, the ancient debates and discussions around it in philosophy, and the problems of using reconstructed only divinatory methods due to the lapse of time. As I did for my last video on latent Christianity, I'll divide this video into chapters so that you can watch in parts or go back and rewatch sections you missed or weren't quite clear on the first time. With that out of the way, let's get this out of the way. If we take the definition of magic as proposed by Radcliffe Evans III in Drawing Down the Moon, Magic in the Ancient Greco-Roman World, as non-normative religious practice, then divination certainly doesn't fit as magic in the Hellenist context. Certain kinds of divination were so normative, as it were, that the governing bodies of entire city-states would go to established oracles at Didyma, Delphi, Claros, and Dodona for major decisions regarding everything from wars to the passage of certain contentious new laws. As I mentioned in my video on politics and Hellenism, the interaction between religion and the state here is a bit complicated, as the state governing bodies had to make the decision to consult the oracle in the first place. Once they did, however, the decision was legally binding, as were the words that the oracle passed along. Okay, so it's not magic from a Hellenist perspective if we go by that definition. What is it then? The Greek word for the divinatory art, Mantike techni, hints at an answer. Mantike is derived from the same word as mania, which refers to an ecstatic state, often accompanied by visions and induced by either substances or actions performed to bring one to said ecstasy. These practices could range from specified breathing exercises to ecstatic dances, such as those found in the Dionysian mystery cults of the Hellenistic era, to fasting, which I don't recommend in the modern day without the guidance of a doctor, by the way, to a specified series of rites and rituals hinted at but never quite revealed to have been passed down in antiquity to induce trance. One specific kind of divination always occurred in this manic state, though we'll get to that in the section on divinatory methods. Techni here refers to a craft, skill, or trained art. This also hints at the two-part nature of ancient divination: the observation or request for a sign, which anyone can do, and the interpretation, which for some forms of divination, such as augury or the observation of natural signs specifically around birds, were said to be the domain specifically of the Mantes, or the hereditary specialists from families that were gifted the art by the divinities in antiquity. For other forms of divination, such as the pronouncements that came from Delphi, or divination by lots or bone throwing, it was thought that anyone could interpret the signs. In Athens, when a particularly unclear portent came through from one of the oracles, Athenian citizens would gather and debate the meaning of the sign from the oracle, and the interpretation that convinced the most people would be taken by the governing body. So far, we have divination as the art of receiving and then interpreting signs, but signs from where? It's clear when one reads anything regarding the Oracle of Delphi or seeing how Mantis like Tiresias were discussed in the epics, the signs were thought to come directly from the gods. Often Apollon, for it was said that he learned the divinatory methods either from his father Zeus himself or, if you believe Apollodorus, received the Mantike from Pan. It was said specifically that Apollon had charge of communicating prophecies both to gods and men after claiming the oracle from the Python upon slaying the beast and atoning for his bloodshed to himself. That said, there are also also associations with Hermes and other forms of divination, such as those related to dream interpretation and delivery, astrology, and drawing lots. Other gods played a role in divination in the myths, such as Athena delivering message through the dreams of several people throughout the Odyssey. When we get to the section on divinatory methods later, we'll talk about oracles that claim messages came from specific gods or that specific gods needed appeasing as part of the message. In other words, divination is complicated. When you put all this together, divination is the art of receiving and/or interpreting signs from the gods related either to clarifying ongoing events or identifying future events and actions. I specify two major classes of divination here, given that seeking information about ongoing situations and information about future actions and events, because different forms of divination tend to deal with different kinds of questions. Note how my definition doesn't state that divination directly foretells the future. Hellenist divination was often unclear, and the gods make their worshippers work for their answers. This is discussed extensively in Cicero's On Divination as being highly manipulatable and evidence of human tampering with the process, but we'll get there. It was thought that events were fixed in time by the Morai, so knowing about a disaster ahead of time could not prevent it. It could, however, allow the querent to mitigate the fallout in their personal life, or in the case of city-states, take action to mitigate the fallout to their own people. The Morai were said to take into account the information you'd receive from divination, though humans have some influence on the eventual outcome through their actions. Some events are fixed in time, and some effects of them are determined by the response of those affected. In other words, human free will could determine which path you take at a fork in the road, but the paths themselves are already set, and not forgeable by your will alone. Philosophers heavily debated this viewpoint, as they did with everything, but this was the perspective from which divinatory methods in Greece were largely born. This brings us to... I'm going to make my bias clear at the beginning of this section in that I disagree with Cicero about the risk of chance playing too big a role in divination for it to be useful, among other things. I believe that divination is a useful tool for Hellenists and pagans of all stripes, and I don't think the gods are limited in their ability to engage with us by the so-called laws of probability. If a god wants you to have a message or hear an answer, they will find a way. That said, a ton of debate existed in ancient times about why divination functioned the way it did, or if it functioned at all. The most prominent example is Cicero's On Divination, which consists of two books. The first has Cicero casting his brother Quintus as the eloquent defender of divination and the representative for the views of the Stoa, the ancient Stoic competitor to the Platonist Academy, which at the time, in Cicero's words, defended nearly every manner of divination under the auspices of if divination works, there are gods. At the time, divination was a huge part of Greek and Roman life. The majority of people believe, very similar to Quintus, that divination was direct communication with the gods on Earth, but that the gods made humans work for their knowledge of future events. To set the stage, Cicero defines divination as presentiment and knowledge of future things, which Quintus then proposes conditional on the gods' existence, as they are the source of divinatory signs. If the gods exist, then divination exists also. If the gods do not exist, divination cannot exist. Another definition is brought up later in Book 2, closer to the one I used in Part 1 from Chrysippus, a famous Stoic writer, that divination is the power to see, understand, and explain premonitory signs given to men by the gods. That's a little closer to the definition that I would use in the modern day. Quintus then proceeds to divide divination into two distinct categories. Natural divination, which includes visions of the future through divinely induced dreams or a frenzied manic state, and artificial divination, which contains most all other forms of divination which must be mastered as an art or taught. These include chiromancy, or divination by lots, cards, other objects, etc., haruspicy, augury, astrology, etc. This kind of divination requires expertise and training, or at the minimum, a text or guide of some kind. When we get to the where of divination, we'll talk about some of the monuments that existed in ancient times for self-service divination under this category. The bulk of Quintus's dialogue in Book 1 is taken up with the numerous Greek and Roman examples of successful divinatory outcomes. These include the horse of Dionysius disappearing in a whirlpool and reappearing later with bees on his mane, successfully predicting the begin of his reign, astrological examples of conjunctions involving the favorability of the births of children, and the heart missing in a sacrificed bull preceding the death of Caesar. Quintus appeals repeatedly to tradition and popular opinion, as well as arguing that diviners have had centuries to perfect their arts empirically. From his perspective, divination had been honed to the point where the majority of predictions could be relied upon as accurate, and the correlations were too strong to deny the role of the gods in the process. Cicero's refutation in Book 2 consists of a number of alternative explanations for the the various signs given as examples in Book 1. What if, for instance, he proposes, if the gods do not exist, some law of nature still causes signs of the future to be produced? Why do the gods give the signs that must be interpreted rather than communicating the future to men directly? Why isn't divination employed to answer every question, such as matters of passing laws that are beneficial or settling matters of science? Would the gods not be expert in these things also? If the gods really do communicate through signs, should they not also be the experts primarily in these matters, and thereby diviners be consulted before every decision? Most importantly, Cicero explores the dynamics between fate, free will, and chance, and comes to the conclusion that if fate exists, there is no need for divination, as foreknowledge does nothing to prevent the event, and if knowledge could change the outcome, there is no fate. In other words, either way, what could divination possibly do for a person if there is no wiggle room for humanity to change course? The rest of Cicero's Book 2 is spent breaking down the various examples from Book 1 and denying the efficacy of divination as a whole. Modern people may recognize a mirror to Euthyphro's dilemma from Plato. Do the gods love good because it is good, or are there things good because they are loved by the gods? I'm not sure I'm wise enough to answer his questions to his satisfaction, though my answer would be something in between. The paths are set, but branching, and human feet choose the branch. Divination enables us to make a more informed decision when considered carefully, and the gods make us work for that information out of respect for the Morai as the controllers of fate and the setters of those paths. Anyone who has built a relationship of Cadis over a decent length of time slowly learns discernment signs of UPG, or unverified personal gnosis, and eventually the fingerprints of the gods in their lives also show them the path that a god may be setting for them. Whether we choose to heed these signs is entirely up to us, and one could argue that learning to interpret UPG is a form of what Quintus calls natural divination. The epics and myths are filled with stories of fate and human branching paths of fate out from where it was originally expected for them to land. The Fates were said to rule even over the gods, but that hasn't stopped the gods from interfering in the paths taken to get to these major events. If you take Quintus and Cicero's definition of divination to only include predictions of events, and actions that can't be easily predicted by science or other methods of reason, then what we have is a system through which the gods provide humans the opportunity to set their feet on the path that will cause them the least harm or the most benefit to them and theirs. This isn't to say that reason isn't involved in the process. The gods make us work to understand their messages, and as we're about to see, sometimes that requires a measure of humility to curb the overeagerness to see a good portent or to minimize a negative one. If the gods are said to love us, then the existence of divination would help prove that love. Before we move on to the where of ancient divination, I'd like to add an aside that I feel that Cicero completely ignores the agency of the gods in his discussion. By representing fate and chance as a binary, he not only does away with the nuance of set branches of paths that humans can then slide into without the ability to forge our own, but also does the gods a disservice by treating their messages as the equivalent of slot machines with predictable outcomes. Hundreds of years of human psychology still can't predict what humans will do with perfect accuracy, despite the efforts of generations of scientists to put human minds into neat little boxes labeled personality types or archetypes. What could possibly lead someone to believe the gods, being so much bigger than we are, would somehow be more predictable? What makes Cicero believe that the times that divination fails are the result of the art and not the desires of the gods themselves or the failure of the querent to interpret the message? Though you could argue that this now puts divination in the unfalsifiable category, that's actually the point. I'm not calling it a science. I'm not arguing that it's completely efficacious or perfect, or that your experiences with it will be. Discernment is a skill, developed over time, and the gods have arguably more free will than humans do. Sometimes they might not answer, or they might answer in a way that is misleading for their own ends. That is part and parcel with relying on a being with free will for answers. The key with divination, as with everything, is approaching with the willingness to accept the answers that you don't like, and the willingness to acknowledge what is within your control, rather than simply surrendering to what is not. The gods help those who help themselves. The most famous divinatory sites across Greece were all anchored to specific places: Delphi, Claros, Dodona, and Didyma, along with smaller oracle sites of different kinds. I'm going to touch briefly on many of them, though the oracles of the dead, the Nekromanteon, will get a video of their own in the future, and were also mentioned briefly in my video on ancestor worship, so I don't plan on going too deep into them here, just mentioning that they exist. Delphi was situated partway up Mount Parnassus, 90 miles northwest of Athens, as the crow flies, as Sarah Iles Johnston put it it in ancient Greek divination, and quite the community sprung up around it. Johnston compares going to Delphi to going to the Vatican. You might be there for a consultation with the Pope, or in this case, the Pythia, which played a very different role societally, but let's continue the comparison. But there was a heck of a lot to do while you were there. Because the trip was so long, for many who sought consultation, a massive network of hotels, inns, and restaurants sprung up around the oracle, and the temple itself grew so wealthy it sponsored the yearly Pythian athletic games. The Pythia herself took her name from the python, the mythic beast said to have been slayed by Apollon to either claim the prophetic powers of the oracle, as told in the Homeric hymn to Apollon, or to establish the oracle there, as told in alternate versions of the tale. Cause, you know, naming a prophetess after a giant snake isn't suggestive at all. Frequently referred to as the Bride of Apollon, allusions that appear graphic in nature to Apollon entering the place that enfolds likely referred to her bosom and the equating of prophesying with breath rather than anything more raunchy. Prophecy and breath were heavily connotatively linked in Greek. So, sorry to disappoint the dirty minds in the room, and the Christians who wanted to disparage Hellenism yet again. The typical conception of how our prophecies worked also doesn't quite line up with the historical evidence. Here's the typical picture you might have heard. A waif-thin, prepubescent girl leans over a chasm and inhales dangerous vapors that cause her eyes to widen and incoherent babbling to issue forth from her lips. Priests on hand translate the babbling into a phrase in Greek, which is written or spoken to the querent that they may ponder it. This phrase is usually vague and clothed in mythic and allegorical language. Even when it is direct, as we'll see, double meanings are common. As I said in part 2, the gods make us work for knowledge that would otherwise be beyond us. First off, virginal in ancient times doesn't quite mean the same thing we think of it today. And frequently, the Pythia would actually be a woman beyond her childbearing years. The Pythia was required to remain celibate during her tenure at the oracle, as intercourse was considered polluting along with most other bodily functions that result in excretions people would rather not have on their skin when the act is finished. Prepubescent women did have the post, it just wasn't exclusive to them the way many folks picture it nowadays. Celibacy has more to do with remaining pure of the influence of miasma, particularly that of intercourse and the consequences of intercourse, i.e. birth, in order to remain a proper receptacle for Apollon's prophetic guidance. Although some ancient intellectuals objected to the phrasing, the words in Greek that describe the process of prophesying translated both to possession from within and seizing from without. Basically, Apollon spoke directly through the Pythia from within her, but as a force, he also didn't always live there, so he seized her from outside when he did so. Prophecies were always in the first person singular and thereby meant to be interpreted as his word directly, merely coming through the prophetess as a vessel unfiltered. No, it didn't refer to that kind of entering. Get your mind out of the gutter or I'll send you to horny jail. So what about the gas? Described using many different words by the ancients, pneuma chief among them, it was said that the tripod upon which the Pythia sat was located in a room that gave access to a chasm from which vapors rose that inspired the prophecy. During the early 20th century, the idea of gases rising from the chasm appeared debunked until later discoveries revealed a secondary fault line from which ethylene, ethane, and methane rose. Ethylene has a sweet smell and can create hallucinations and cause ecstatic trance in a high enough concentration. But those in the room with the Pythia would be affected also if concentrations were high enough to do this by itself. Plutarch proposed that the vapors prepared the Pythia to enter the state of prophecy, and that appears most likely to be the case. Other rites have been described which would allow her to enter a state of ecstasy or mania that would then bring the prophecies forth, but the vapors themselves didn't get her high enough to do it on their own. The next part of the story, that of the frenzied or babbling Pythia, also appears to be largely a modern invention. Most ancient sources describe the Pythia as speaking in a controlled manner, and ancient sources accusing the Pythia of accepting bribes lend support to this idea. How could someone in an incoherent, babbling state in need of translation be of sound enough mind to alter the prophecy they're giving? Plutarch also observes that some Pythias speak in verse and others, particularly those from farming communities with less means, spoke in prose. It doesn't make a lot of sense if the Pythia babbled out prophecies like a maniac and had to be translated. If the same people are doing the translating for multiple Pythias, the messages would be in a similar style. These prophecies were then left to the querent, or if the querent were there on behalf of a governing body, the city-state to interpret. There are many notorious examples of the Pythia giving what appeared to be a clear answer, and human hubris and lack of critical examination getting in the way. For example, Croesus, the king of Lydia, asked how long he would reign. The Pythia replied, until a mule sits on the throne of the Medes. Croesus took this to mean forever, but in fact, Apollon meant Cyrus, a person of mixed birth like a mule is mixed species, and when Cyrus took the throne, Croesus was toppled. It's important to critically examine the message received from even modern divinatory methods, including reconstructed ones, for exactly this reason. I'm gonna repeat this so much it'll probably become a meme. The gods make us work for our answers. This brings us to Zeus's oracle at Dodona, famous in ancient times for the oracle and famous to many modern Hellenists for the lot oracle that survived there. We'll go over divination by lots in the next part on how divination works, though briefly I'll mention it in this section as well. The oracle at Dodona was considered the greatest competitor to the oracle at Delphi, though much of the evidence we have of its use skews heavily towards local consultation. Much of that might also be attributed to the remnants of the lot oracle being there rather than any actual skewing in history. Ancient writers often refer to both oracles in the same breath at any rate, the oracles of Apollon and Zeus. We have a number of conflicting descriptions of how Dodona operated. One group of prophets was referred to as the Seloi, later Heloi, and appeared to be male priests described as sleeping on the ground and having dirty feet, who prophesy what they saw in their dreams. Another group, this one composed of women, were referred to as the Doves in Greek, and were said to prophesy after being filled with the sounds of ringing brass cauldrons by Zeus. These massive brass cauldrons were one of the defining features at Dodona, and tons of archaeological evidence of them exists. Much like the oracle at Delphi, these words were in first person and were said to come directly from the god himself. Another form of prophecy employed at Dodona used lead tablets. Soft lead was often used for writing in ancient times, and querents from all over Greece would come and pose questions that could only be answered yes or no on these tablets. Special note, by the way, we now know that lead is incredibly toxic. Even the so-called lead in your pencil is actually graphite because, again, lead is incredibly toxic. Do not handle lead. If you're going to reproduce this particular form of divination, please use paper. Please. We have the technology now. This has been a PSA. They would also inscribe their own name on the back. There's evidence that the tablets were cleaned and reused after the process by the priests. The tablets were placed in one jar, and in another, a number of colorful rocks with inscriptions of yes or no were placed. The priestess would draw one tablet out of the one and a stone out of the other, announcing the name of the person and the answer on the stone at the same time without ever reading the question. We know very little about the oracle at Claros, beyond the fact that the prophet drank from a sacred spring, and the priest, whose titles translates to singer of prophecies, would give the words spoken by the prophet back to the querent. We have even less information about who would seek these prophecies, as only 25 of them have survived, and of those, a few are in dispute as legitimate prophecies by scholars. Didyma was even more confusing, as we have a number of different strange founding myths, and one rather complex description from Iamblichus about how prophecy worked, involving a staff, a throne of a sort, water that gave off vapors, and inhalation or washing or dipping of clothes in said water. It's not clear from the description if this was all done at once, or if different prophecies used different parts of these actions. The one thing he's clear on is that they were all preparatory, and the prophecy itself came from Apollon, to whom the oracle belonged. A final class of oracles I'd like to discuss before we move on to the how-to of divination are the so-called incubation oracles. These were places said to be sacred to specific gods or heroes where querents would offer and then sleep in beds on site, hoping for oracular visions to be given to them in dreams. These oracles were largely dedicated to Asclepios, Podalirius, Calchas, and Amphiaros, all of whom, according to myth, had once been mortal themselves. This led to a perceived closeness with these deities compared to Zeus and Apollon, who by their nature were said to be more distant, and they had never experienced the trappings of mortal life directly. Though a ton of different questions could be answered in incubation oracles, disease and curative measures were their bread and butter, as it were. That said, the questions asked of these oracles overall were far more personal and specific. Things like finding loved ones, receiving healing, dealing with family members who damaged property, and other very human concerns that once human deities might be able to understand better than deities who'd never had that experience. Homer himself said that the gods, being deathless, view the world differently than humans do. They despair when their favorites die and descend to the kingdom of Hades, but they don't have any experience of death themselves. I talked a bit about the Montes in my video on the priesthood, though the whole of their divinatory methods deserve its own video. To be honest, I could have made an entire video just about what we know about the oracles, and I might still someday in the future. Their methods ranged from interpreting natural signs and symbols to dream interpretation to interpreting unwilling motions on the part of people surrounding them. Over 100 different kinds of divination have been documented as existing, though though few if any writings exist on the majority of them, and many have to be inferred from the textual evidence like plays and epics rather than direct how-to manuals. But I wanted to give you guys a taste just how diverse even the indirect methods of ancient divination were. We haven't even touched on the personal or self-service divination yet. Obviously, we don't have the option of going to one of these oracles today to get answers to our questions, and huffing gas seems like a rather unsafe thing to do in search of divine answers. So, what is a modern Hellenist to do? Alright, big long caveat coming. I'm gonna caveat this section with the warning that nothing I say here could possibly be exhaustive, nor am I implying that this is the only way to do divination as a Hellenist. I don't think the gods are limited by Reconstructionist methods. It's as silly to me when someone says a deity can't use tarot to communicate as it is when people say that soda or modern food stuff can't be a viable offering because it's modern. If these traditions had continued into the modern day with the kind of influence and societal support they had in ancient times, then the materials offered and the nature of the offerings themselves would likely have changed with the times as well. We saw a diversity of offerings and a transformation of practices even in ancient times, when tradition was highly valued as the practices were said to be handed to humans from the gods themselves. Also, divination should never replace therapy, counseling, or your own work on improving yourself. It is very easy to become superstitious and look for signs everywhere or get what you interpret as a bad reading on something and just give up. But remember what I've said throughout this video. The gods make us work for knowledge. All it takes is a reframing of perspective for you to potentially reorient yourself either to something better or a different direction that could carry success. As for therapy, there isn't a replacement for therapy. Divination, especially, cannot replace therapy. If you need therapy and have access to it, go to therapy. Divination can pair with therapy if your therapist is open to it. Mine even has done dream interpretation with me, though I'm rather lucky because my therapist is also pagan as heck. Do not try and replace medication or therapy with divination. Just don't do it. Also, addendum 2, readers aren't therapists. You are not a therapist if you are a reader unless you are a licensed therapist, in which case, I guess you are, but the majority of readers are not. A client-reader relationship is not a therapy relationship. Don't do that. Readings can get very, very personal and the line gets blurry. Don't mistake the two. Leave the therapy to the licensed therapist. Got it? Okay. What follows in the rest of this section are both reviews of so-called self-service forms of divination we have surviving from ancient times, as well as personal suggestions for adaptation of some of the ancient forms that don't require ecstatic states to produce. As I've stressed this entire time, the gods make us work for our answers. Although they aren't necessarily limited by the medium to gift us with them, we must develop our own skills and critical thinking and discernment. The ancient Athenians would debate the meaning of oracle pronouncements brought back from Delphi before accepting a specific interpretation, and I found in my own life that discussion of ambiguous answers can regularly yield a more accurate or detailed interpretation and allow me to consider angles that I wouldn't on my own. Given the definition at the start of this video, it's best to treat divinatory seeking like any kind of ritual worship. Personally, I always purify with Carneeps and treat divination as a full ritual, and give offerings to several gods before consulting any oracle or deck. Hermes to transmit the message, plus extra incense if it's a lot divination under his auspices, Apollon if it's one of his oracles, Athena and Zeus to help guide me toward an accurate interpretation, and if another god comes up in the reading, them as well for the message that they gave me afterwards. I do my best not to ask the same question multiple times because that may appear as though I'm trying to get a different answer, though if I'm confused, I might ask for a clarification using an additional method, such as clarifying a Delphic maxim pull with an alphabet oracle or a small tarot spread. I find that each of the various oracles tend to answer different kinds of questions better than others, so don't be too concerned if it takes you a bit of time to get the hang of practicing whichever you choose. That said, let's take a look at a small sample of the options that we have attestations for, as well as a couple of modern examples. Remember, the gods are bigger than us. If you want to try out a new kind of divination, there's no reason they can't be involved in the process. Generally, you'll get some pretty strong signs if they want nothing to do with what you're doing. Various kinds of self-service divination existed in ancient times. Most of the evidence we have for them exists in Latin from the Hellenistic period and onward, though the first we're going to discuss is older, the oracular monuments in southwest Anatolia. These so-called dice oracles were largely operated by making an offering to the statue of Hermes that the oracle monument sat at the foot of, then tossing 5 astragalloi, or knucklebone dice, and figuring out what your toss corresponded to. These were usually the knucklebones of deer, sheep, or goats. Knucklebones like this can naturally only fall onto one of 4 sides, each valued at a different number of points. The book Mantike has a chart translating the monuments by Fritz Graf, which some bloggers have also reproduced online as well. If you Google dice oracles, you'll find at least one of them. You can get 3D printed knucklebone dice on various sites, or get real deer or goat knucklebones on Etsy if you want to try out the system. The various predictions on the oracle chart correspond to different deities and tend to be fairly direct in terms of the answers they provide. So if you choose to try out this particular divinatory method, I'd suggest making an offering to the deity who answers afterward as well. The monuments we have are actually complete, or at least that most of them are, and the translations provided by Graf actually synthesize all of them, so it's a pretty accurate reconstruction of these monuments as they existed. Another form of ancient divination by lots we have surviving evidence of are the alphabet oracles. 2 different versions have been documented online by John Opsapaus, who also published an excellent book that contains both the alphabet oracle with an updated translation and an oracle involving the Delphic maxims that I personally use daily, the Oracles of Apollo, practical ancient Greek divination today, as it heavily cites sources and does a remarkable job of making both oracle types accessible with whatever you have on hand. The alphabet oracles have charts that can be accessible by a knucklebone dice in a similar way to the dice oracles using the charts from the book. For those that are more RPG inclined, the original values are 1, 3, 4, and 6, so if you toss a d4, the 1 face would be 1, 2 would be 3, 3 would be 4, and 4 would be 6. You may also even be able to get 4-sided dice with custom values printed on their sides. There are also coin oracle versions with all of the alphabetical letters printed available on Etsy, or you could make your own version with coins, rocks, or other objects with the letters painted on them. There's also a version that uses 5 coins, 2 of the same and 3 separate others that you can use in order to find the information. Before I got my alphabet oracle from Etsy, that's the method that I used. Much like the dice version, you would either roll the dice and add up the chart to find the message, use the coins and flip them using the heads or tails to find the position on the chart, then ponder it, or draw a lot and ponder the message there. Either way, these are directly linked to Apollon, so it's best to give an offering before and after to him. The quote-unquote incubation oracles could be imitated in modern times by giving offerings to one of the deities mentioned, or Hermes or Hypnos, who both have aspects dealing with dreams, before bed with prayers beseeching them to answer one's questions in said dreams. Then offerings upon waking once an answer is received in thanks. Many ancient and modern books on dream symbol interpretation exist, though I personally think that such things are very personal, and thereby best to puzzle out on your own or with folks that you trust rather than relying on an author's opinion of what your dreams really mean. After all, you're less likely to dream of, say, an ass dragging a cart in front of it than an ancient person. Many people in my audience haven't actually seen an ass. The animal, not the body part. Alright, go to horny jail. We can also adapt the ancient oracle structure from Dodona for our own use. If you paint a number of stones and/or coins different colors to represent yes or no, or paint the words yes and no on stones, and then place them into an opaque jar or bag, do your prayers and offerings before mixing about the stones, and draw one after writing down your question, which you need to make sure you formulate in a yes or no fashion, you can reproduce a very similar version of the oracle at Dodona. Another form of self-service divination came in the form of the sortes. There were several of these: Sortes Virgilianae, Sortes Homericae, Sortes Biblicae, Sortes Sangalensis. You get the idea. The Sortes Homericae in particular were found in 3 specific copies of the Greek magical papyri and used a knucklebone dice system to correspond to verses found in the Iliad and the Odyssey. It wouldn't be too difficult to construct a similar system for modern personal use, though the ancient use doesn't quite fit the modern bibliomancy description of opening a book and reading the first verse you see. That's also a form of modern divination, but for those who prefer more organized systems, such a system did exist in ancient times and could be recreated for translations with modern eyes, or even new systems devised using different verses. After all, the gods aren't exactly limited in how they communicate with us. Many Mantic forms of divination relied on the interpretation of natural signs from birds and animals, though many of the guides that existed in ancient times for these sorts of things have disappeared, and most of us aren't living in Greece and wouldn't see the exact wildlife they were meant to document anyhow. Learning to observe signs and coincidences and recognize the sensation of observing a sign, i.e. developing discernment, is a skill that comes with time and experience in Hellenism. This is a form of natural divination that takes a lot of practice, and you could make a lot of mistakes, but ultimately with a lot of documentation of your experiences could allow you to create a catalog of how the gods communicate with you specifically in your area. This kind of divination can also be cross-referenced with other forms such as dream interpretation or lot oracles, or divination by cards, which is a more modern form. Which brings me to the more popular modern forms of divination like tarot and oracle decks. There is nothing wrong with them. And in fact, I've found that Apollon and Athena seem to have no issue communicating using them as mediums for their messages. Different kinds of decks have different focuses, so it's good to start with one that's relatively basic if you're new, like Hanson-Roberts or Rider-Waite, or a smaller Oracle deck, and add new decks as you feel inspired to. As with all other forms of divination, giving an offering to the deities you are asking the question to, in this case, likely Hermes because he has rulership over divination by lots of any kind, both before and after, is always a good idea. Formulating your divinatory question could be a section all its own. Unfortunately, I can't give more than general guidelines, as question formulation depends heavily on the divinatory method employed and your experience with it. It's best to think carefully about both the system and the question before you even start, to ensure the answer you receive is actually useful. Asking a yes or no type question to the Oracle system using the Delphic maxims will get you an answer, but it might not be a particularly useful one. Tarot is particularly well suited to questions where you need an in-depth look at the surrounding situation, as the wealth of symbolism works to your advantage there, whereas something like the Alphabet Oracle might be better suited to looking at potential consequences for a particular decision you feel you've already made or are about to make. It's a big part of why I advocate learning multiple systems of divination, preferably over time so you don't overwhelm yourself, so you can get a feel for which are the most useful for the particular kind of advice you might need. In ancient times, question formulation was a key consideration before someone would even approach an oracle. Xenophon was said to have formulated his question to the Pythia as, "Which god should I offer to for victory?" when gearing up to go to war, rather than asking about the outcome of the battle. Formulations like this locked the Pythia into a specific kind of advice, thereby preventing Apollon from siding against Xenophon in the war, or at the very least from giving Xenophon an answer that he could misinterpret. Similarly, when formulating your own questions, make sure you think carefully about the wording before you begin your prayer and offering. Certain kinds of wording, paired with the system you use, can lock you into certain kinds of answers. You want to make sure that the answers you're getting are going to actually be useful. Just remember, no matter how direct the answer might seem, it's best to reflect on it for a while before deciding how to respond. The gods make us work for our information, and sometimes a direct answer might not mean what you think it does. A great king once asked the Pythia about going to war with another nation. She replied that he would destroy a great nation if he did. Eagerly, he rushed off to war and found himself utterly crushed by enemy forces. He wrote a complaint back to the Pythia, who replied simply that if he had merely asked a clarifying question, he would have realized that the nation he would destroy was his own. In other words, don't be afraid to use a secondary oracle or ask clarifying questions if you're stumped, or consult other people if you're concerned you might be so invested in getting a specific answer that you might be rushing into action. Everything that follows is my personal opinion, though some of it does have validations in my research. Back in part 2, I mentioned that Cicero specified that divination was best for finding information that might otherwise be inaccessible to you through simple scientific deduction, logic, or reason. Many folks do a daily tarot card drawing or divination by lots to reflect on the Delphic maxims for the day, which is a fantastic way to use both of these systems, though less than useful for some more direct, like the Knucklebone Dice Oracle. Many folks ask for guidance before major decisions, which can be a wonderful practice both to learn the systems for when you need major guidance and to keep the gods and their wisdom on your mind throughout the day, though it does require a great deal of reflection to be useful. Apollon has given me the same maxims several days in a row, which is pretty unlikely with the 147 different combinations and the specific coin method that I use to get them. Note, this is not a draw by lots, this is tossing 14 coins and somehow getting the same thing 3 days in a row, in an effort to really make sure that I actually focus on that particular maxim during that time period. Remember that divination and interpretation are skills you develop over time. It's best not to do readings for other people if you ever plan to in the first place when you're first learning a system, as you might miss things in your interpretation that folks more familiar wouldn't. This is especially true for tarot, given how many different interpretation systems there are for the general system itself, let alone for the individual decks with individual symbolism and individual focuses. Although I do plan on doing an entire video on divinatory ethics and what to expect from a reading, yes, a little further off in the future, both as a diviner and a client, there are times where you might be so emotionally involved in a situation that seeking a reading for another person may be useful. This can either be to clarify a reading you have done for yourself, or to begin the discussion entirely because you don't feel like you can be objective enough to even do a reading. Make sure the reader that you seek assistance from understands your specific views on how divination works and see if they agree with them. Some diviners don't believe the gods have any place in a reading, for example, and this might affect how the reading goes for you. That doesn't mean that they can't overcome this hurdle, obviously, but if you choose a reader like this, you may wish to do your own preparation before getting the reading done. I personally shy away away from any readings involving the dead, especially the recency dead, as that gets into very sticky territory ethics-wise. If you do plan on doing readings involving the dead, it's best to do them for yourself using a system you're familiar with, rather than trying to do one by a proclaimed medium. Not all these folks are scammers, but enough mediums in my experience have been to be wary of the practice as a whole. No offense to anybody who feels they are one. Again, this is just my own experience, and I expressed already these are my own opinions. Divination is an incredibly rewarding practice that allows us to communicate with our gods more directly than many people who feel they struggle with acknowledging UPG can otherwise. It gives us some measure of safety in our lives when we're seeking answers to the unknown or advice from beings with a heck of a lot more experience than mortals can amass. Care must be taken and scrutiny applied, but the methods can be incredibly fulfilling and rewarding as we develop our skill in the art of interpretation and reception of the signs that the gods give us. With that said, that was a super long video, so thank you so much for sticking through that. If you're new here, gas the subscribe button and babble at the like in a manic state. Drop that into the comments and tell me about your experiences with divination. What methods you like, the concerns you have, your triumphs and struggles. Or just tell me that all my visions and divinatory experiences are actually a delusion and I'm cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. Like, y'all haven't been saying that anyway, but if you got this far, thank you so much for the engagement. Seriously, that's a ton of watch time. Y'all dedicated. Special thanks also to my patrons. You all supported me 100% in my transition to longer form content, and I couldn't do this without you. This video was months in the making, and I hope you all get a taste of what's to come. I feel like the longer form allows me to explore topics like this in a greater deal of depth from many angles, and dropping down to 2 videos a month allows me to recover in between from the videos and work on my book. Also, the calendar project launched successfully, and so many of you supported it as well. I am so proud of what the channel accomplished last year, and I look forward to braving this new year with you all at my back. May the cycle of reciprocity between us ever remain positive. And remember, we're stronger together.